You've probably carried it for so long you don't even notice it anymore. That quiet voice, that knot in your chest, that feeling that no matter how much you give, it's never quite enough. It follows you into relationships, into work, into silence. And when things fall apart, you don't just feel sad. You feel defective, as if you're the one who's fundamentally wrong. But what if that feeling didn't start with you? Maybe it began in a room where your joy was too loud, or where your sadness was met with silence. Maybe it began with a look, a shift in their eyes when you said something true, or with a sigh, a subtle withdrawal, a punishment for being too much or not enough. You were small. You didn't know they were projecting their own wounds onto your softness. You just knew you wanted to be loved. So you adapted. You became careful, quiet, clever. You learned which version of you was allowed, and you wore that version like skin. That's not weakness. That's survival. But the cost was high, because every time you were praised for being the version they could accept, the real you got pushed deeper into the dark. And now, maybe you don't even know who that real you is anymore. This is not just a story about childhood. It's a story about identity, about the shadow you were forced to carry before you even knew what a shadow was. It's about how a child's brilliance, messiness, and truth can be twisted into something shameful in the mirror of a parent who never looked at themselves. And it's about the quiet courage it takes to go back, to find the child they couldn't love. And finally, love them yourself. You don't have to keep living like your soul is a problem to solve. You are not the shame you inherited. You are not the voice that says you ruin things. You are not broken. You are buried. And this journey, this story, is about remembering where to dig. There was a time when you didn't question your worth, a time when you laughed with your whole body, when you cried without shame, when your joy had no leash around its neck. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just being, and being was enough. You lived close to the ground of your own self, untouched by the sharp edges of judgment. But the mirror changed. One day, love started to feel like a test you had to pass, and somewhere in that quiet shift, you began to disappear. You didn't notice it at first. How could you? You were small, soft, and needing. You looked up at someone who was supposed to protect your light, but instead, they held up a broken mirror, a mirror that twisted your reflection. You thought it was you. You thought the problem was in your face, your feelings, your fire, but it was never you. It was a projection, an unconscious shadow from someone else's past, spilling into your innocence. That's how the fracture begins, not with a scream, but with the quiet breaking of the trust between your soul and its first witness. Carl Jung called this first version of you the self, whole, undivided, alive in the deepest language of the psyche. In Jungian psychology, this image of the original child is not just emotional, it's symbolic. You were an archetype in motion, a figure of emotional purity and intuitive knowing. But when love became a transaction, you were forced to exile parts of yourself. The fire of your anger, the power of your joy, the wisdom of your tears, all became threats to the fragile ego of someone who could not bear to see your wholeness. So, you hid. Not because you wanted to, but because the cost of being real became too high. You began to walk a psychic tightrope between longing and silence, between truth and survival. What was once free now became filtered. You began to shape yourself into something smaller, more pleasing, less wild. And the most painful part? You believed you were doing something wrong. That's the cruelty of shadow projection. It paints the disowned parts of another onto your soul and then calls you broken for carrying them. But here's the truth I need you to remember. The child you were has never left. The emotional truth of your original light is not dead, it's buried. It waits underneath the weight of unconscious projections, repressed traits, and false beliefs. It waits in dreams, in memories, in the body's ache for something it cannot name. The psyche remembers. Even if your conscious mind has forgotten, your nervous system holds the map. Your pain is not a weakness. It's the call of what was once disowned, echoing back to you. Shadow integration begins not with fixing yourself, but with feeling what you were never allowed to feel. The child in you doesn't need to be told who They are. They need to be seen. Not for how well they perform, not for how quiet they stay, but for how deeply they feel. This is the symbolic return. The moment when you start to realize the self was never lost, only exiled. To turn toward that inner figure is to step back into your own center. It's not a performance. It's a reunion. You are not too much. You never were. That's just the old voice of someone else's shadow, lingering in your mind like a ghost. But ghosts don't get the final word. You do. And as you walk this inner journey, you're not becoming someone new. You're becoming someone true. The light that was dimmed can still shine. Not through perfection, but through presence. Not by escaping the shadow, but by embracing it. That's what it means to begin healing. That's what it means to come home. You were blamed for things you didn't do. Not just in words, but in silence, in glares, in the subtle withdrawal of love. You felt it in your stomach, in the way their eyes changed when you were too loud, too curious, too sad. And deep down, even as a child, you knew it wasn't really about you, but you didn't have the words for it yet. Only the ache, only the confusion of feeling punished for simply being yourself. That's how the guilt started growing roots where your joy should have bloomed. In Jungian psychology, this is more than a family dynamic. It's a psychic wound. When a parent refuses to face their own shadow, what Carl Jung called the disowned self, they unconsciously pass it down. Their anger becomes your flaw. Their shame becomes your secret. Their failures become your fear. You end up carrying a burden that was never yours to begin with, but you still carry it. Because children don't question the mirror. They believe what it shows. You didn't know you were absorbing someone else's unresolved grief. You didn't know that what you were being punished for were repressed emotions that didn't even belong to you. This is the cruelty of psychological repression. It doesn't stay hidden. It leaks. It needs a vessel. And too often that vessel becomes the child. That's how complexes are formed. A psychic conflict between what you feel and what you're allowed to express. Over time, this conflict hardens into identity, and you forget what's yours and what was projected onto you. You may still hear their voice inside you, not just the words, but the tone, that cold, clipped disappointment, that silence that screamed louder than any rage. It became your inner judge. Your shadow wasn't born from your own darkness. It was shaped by theirs. And now, you walk through life haunted by beliefs that were never yours to believe. I'm selfish. I'm not enough. I ruin things. These aren't truths. They're echoes of someone else's unconscious pain, stitched into your soul. But this isn't the end of your story. Confronting the shadow doesn't mean blaming. It means unburdening. It means seeing clearly what was handed to you and deciding to lay it down. You don't need to carry your parents' shame. You don't need to redeem their unlived life. You were not born to be a mirror for someone else's denial. You were born to be seen for who you truly are, not who someone needed. You to be in their own unfinished story. There's a grief in this truth, a deep, aching grief for the childhood that never got to be innocent. But there's also power in naming it, in knowing that the guilt, the shame, the self-hate were never yours. That's the beginning of psychological healing. Not a fix, but a release, a coming back to your own emotional ground. And once you stop carrying what was never yours, you begin to feel what was always waiting underneath. Your own unbroken center, quietly alive. Healing doesn't erase what happened. It reclaims the part of you that got hidden beneath someone else's shadow. You get to confront that darkness, not to destroy it, but to understand its origin. And in that understanding, you take back your name, your voice, your reflection. That's what it means to make the unconscious conscious. That's what it means to finally breathe in your own skin. You learned early that truth had a cost, that your feelings were too loud, your needs too much, your light too blinding. So you made yourself smaller. You polished your voice, controlled your face, adjusted your soul to match the weather of someone else's moods. And maybe they smiled, maybe they approved, but deep down, you knew it wasn't you they loved. It was the version of you that didn't make them uncomfortable. That's when the mask began to form. Carl Jung called this mask the persona. In Jungian psychology, the persona is meant to be a bridge between our inner world and the outer one. But for the child of a narcissistic parent, it becomes a prison, a tool not for connection, but for survival. You start to believe that this mask is who you are, that the one who performs, pleases, excels, and never complains is your real face. And yet, somewhere behind it, the real you is screaming, not to be perfect, just to be. This creates a deep ego-shadow relationship. The more you rely on the false self to be accepted, the more your authentic self sinks into the shadow. Every time you silence your sadness, dismiss your needs, or pretend you're fine, you're burying another part of your truth. This creates a psychic conflict that doesn't go away. It turns into anxiety, numbness, burnout. You can feel it in your body, the tension in your jaw, the weight in your chest, the silence that buzzes even in a crowded room. It's hard to let go of the false self, because even though it hurts, it also kept you alive. It helped you survive. Emotional abandonment. It gave you a way to belong, even if that belonging came at the cost of your soul. That's the trap. You start to think that if you remove the mask, no one will stay, that without it, you'll be unloved, unsafe, unseen. But the truth is, you were never truly seen with it on. The persona doesn't invite love. It blocks it. You may wonder who you are without the roles you've played, without the smile you rehearsed, without the silence you wore like armor. That fear is real, but so is the person underneath, the one with repressed desires, honest emotions, raw beauty. That self hasn't vanished. It's waiting for you to make room, waiting for you to stop performing and start breathing again. And the moment you do, you begin a symbolic transformation, not into someone new, but into someone real. The journey of emotional integration doesn't start with confidence. It starts with confusion, with trembling hands and unsure steps. But with each truth you speak, with each mask you drop, you come closer to your own center. You reclaim your voice from the unconscious mind that learned to mute it, and you start to realize you don't need to earn love by disappearing. You deserve love for existing. Your soul didn't come here to be a mirror for someone else's needs. It came to be whole. That's the call of shadow work. Not to destroy the persona, but to free you from being ruled by it. To remember that beneath the false self is a person worthy of truth, connection, and peace. That person is you, and they're still here. And if you feel like going a little deeper, I carefully prepared a gift for you. It may look small on the outside, but it goes deep. It was made for those quiet moments when you suddenly notice you're here, but not really present. You're breathing, but not really alive. Inside, you won't find answers or fixes, but you might find a way back. Back to the parts of you that got left behind. Back to the gentle voice you stopped listening to. Back to your true self, the one that still remembers who you are. Not a better version of yourself, not a new version of yourself, just a whole version of yourself. You'll find the link to your gift right there in the pinned comment. So, if your soul is tired of moving through life without really feeling it, if your soul is tired of waking up and not knowing why, click the link now. There's a voice inside you that sounds like your own, but it isn't. It tells you you're not enough, that you're too much, that you're selfish for needing rest, for setting boundaries, for wanting to be loved without performance. That voice is not the voice of your soul. It's the echo of someone else's shame, projected into you when you were too young to resist. And the worst part, you believed it. Because when you're a child, you believe what your parents' eyes say about you. Carl Jung called this shadow projection. In Jungian psychology, it happens when a person refuses to face their own inner darkness and instead sees it in someone else. A narcissistic parent can't tolerate their own feelings of failure, envy, or weakness, so they see those things in their child. And not just see, they speak them, act them, reinforce them. Over time, the child doesn't just receive the projection, they absorb it. It becomes part of the internal world, a voice, a presence, a belief. This is how inherited shame is born. Through repeated moments of subtle humiliation, withdrawal of affection, or words that pierce deeper than silence ever could. You start to question your instincts. You learn to distrust your own goodness. You second-guess your emotions before they even finish rising. And so you begin to sabotage joy before it settles, destroy peace before it lasts, reject love before it roots, all because some part of you still believes you're unworthy of it. But what if that inner critic isn't truly yours? What if the shame you carry was placed there by someone who couldn't carry their own? This is the quiet revolution of shadow work, not in becoming better, but in becoming free. Free from unconscious beliefs that don't belong to you. Free from patterns of self-punishment that trace back to someone else's fear. Free from the illusion that your suffering is proof of who you are. These internal conflicts are not just psychological, they're physical. You feel them in the tightening of your chest, the clenching of your stomach, the urge to apologize for existing. This is the body's memory of being seen as wrong for simply being alive. That's what projection does. It tricks you into carrying what was never yours, then punishes you for feeling its weight. But you don't have to keep doing that. You're allowed to listen deeper, to ask, whose voice is this really? The personal shadow is not your enemy. It's a doorway, a symbolic space where what was buried begins to speak again. And when you dare to listen, not to the inherited shame, but to your own truth, you begin to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in quiet moments of clarity, in recognizing that your worth doesn't need to be proven, in knowing that your tenderness isn't weakness, in feeling, for the first time in a long time, like your own voice matters. Psychic liberation begins here, in separating the voices, in making the unconscious conscious, in speaking your truth, even if your voice trembles. Because the inner darkness you inherited isn't your destiny. It's the beginning of your return. There's a place inside you that still remembers. Not in words, but in feelings, in dreams, in the quiet ache you can't explain. It's the part of you that never stopped waiting, to be seen, to be loved, to be held without needing to earn it. That's the disowned child, the one you had to abandon to survive, the one who cried too loudly, felt too deeply, and wanted too much. The one who learned to disappear, but that child never left. They just went underground, beneath the layers of shame and silence. Carl Jung called this process individuation. In Jungian psychology, it's the journey of becoming whole, not by chasing perfection, but by reclaiming the parts of yourself you had to reject. Integrating the shadow means turning toward what was once exiled. And there, in the shadows, quiet, the child waits. Not broken, just buried, covered in years of pretending, performing, and protecting. And yet, still alive, still sacred, still you. You may feel far from that child, disconnected, unsure of how to return. But the path isn't outside of you, it's within. Through emotional integration, you begin to feel again what you were taught to numb. The grief, the longing, the beauty of being sensitive in a world that tried to harden you. And as you feel, you begin to hear. That small voice, once silenced, starts to speak. Not in blame, but in truth. I'm still here, it says, and I miss you. This is the symbolic transformation. The moment when you stop running from the past and start walking toward it with open arms. Not to relive it, but to retrieve what was lost. Through active imagination, through dreams, through the quiet listening of your own body. The psyche begins to speak in its symbolic language. It shows you images, memories, sensations. It shows you the places where your soul split in two, and it invites you to bring those parts home. You are not empty. You are full of forgotten pieces. And each one carries a story, a symbol, a truth. This is inner alchemy, not magic, but meaning. The transformation of pain into presence, of shame into compassion, of silence into song. It's not fast, and it's not always clear, but it's real. And it starts every time you choose to feel instead of flee, to sit with the shadow instead of fighting it, to see the child in you, not as a problem, but as a guide. Your psychic wholeness doesn't come from healing them. It comes from healing your relationship to yourself, from building a new personal myth, one that doesn't revolve around being not enough, one that begins with, "I was always here." Because that's the truth. You didn't lose yourself. You adapted. You twisted into shapes to survive. And now you get to unwind, to return to the original shape of your soul, soft and wild and whole. This is the end of one story, but the beginning of another. Not a story of fixing, but of remembering, of reuniting with the sweet child who never stopped being you, and finally calling them by name. And if something I said reminded you of your own story or stirred something inside you, feel free to share it in the comments. I'd really love to hear it. What you have to say matters, not just to me, but maybe to someone else who's going through something similar. Sometimes putting it into words is already part of the healing. If something inside you still wants to understand yourself, there's another video waiting for you on the screen. And maybe what's in there is exactly what you've been needing to hear. Click it if that's where your soul is asking to go.